Hello everyone. Today we will be discussing the Balkan Wars, the last major conflicts to break out in Europe before the First World War. Indeed, in many ways, the First World War can be perceived as a third Balkan War in and of itself. As we discussed in a previous lecture, the Balkan states had been formed out of a combination of nationalist insurgency and great power conferences. None of the new nation-states contained all of the people that they considered to be their own within their borders, and the fact that they had been formed in violent rebellion perhaps explains why the new nations looked to another violent action in order to achieve full national unification. In the course of pursuing this national unification, however, the interests of the different Balkan states were destined to come into conflict with each other. Were farmers who spoke Bulgarian but attended a Greek church service on Sundays Bulgarians or Greeks? To which state did they belong? Generals and nationalist politicians claimed that only warfare could solve such questions. The battle to claim more national land was also complicated by the historical legacy left behind by historians who rediscovered the history of the Balkan states that had existed in the Middle Ages. All of the countries in the region could appeal to the legacy of empires that they had once possessed. These were, and are, colloquially known as Greater Serbia, Greater Albania, and so on. The problem was that the borders of these empires overlapped to a great extent, given that they had all existed at different times in history. As a result, one could not create a Greater Serbia without taking lands not only claimed by Albania, but in which Albanians had lived and worked alongside Serbs, and indeed had done for centuries. In the first decade of the 20th century, such disputes seemed only theoretical, as the Ottoman Empire still remained a powerful force keeping the Balkan states from each other's throats. Whether Macedonian peasants were Greeks or Bulgarians was an irrelevant question if they were to remain as Ottoman subjects. The Ottoman Empire, however, was increasingly seen as a weak target. In 1911, the Italians, the weakest of all of Europe's great powers, declared war on the Ottomans over what is today's Libya. The Italians, whose forces employed the first aeroplanes ever used in the military sphere, and who dropped the first ever bombs from said airplanes, easily defeated the Ottoman forces, encouraging the Balkan states to take action against the empire themselves without needing to wait for the permission of the great powers. Albania, traditionally loyal to the Ottoman Empire, was surprisingly the first area of the Balkans to rise up, even before the Italian War. Following the Young Turk Revolution in 1908, Albanians had been promised democratic reforms and greater autonomy. When these promises were subsequently ignored, in 1910, Albanians embarked on an armed struggle to force the government to agree to grant their demands. At first, the Albanian Uprising was crushed, and the Ottomans were able to reassume control. However, after the war with Italy fundamentally distracted and weakened the Ottoman forces, Albanian rebels, now concentrated in today's Kosovo, were able to inflict a number of defeats upon the government forces. They were to be aided by the defection of a number of Ottoman officers who considered the Albanians to be a better guarantor of the protection of Muslims in the region than the empire itself was. Albania's Balkan neighbours were alarmed at the prospect of Albanian autonomy, which would have left Albanians the dominant force in areas that they considered to be their own, most notably in Kosovo. The Balkan League of Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece and Montenegro was formed under Russian guidance in the spring of 1912 to take Macedonia away from Turkey and Kosovo away from the Albanians. The League was able to field a combined force of 750,000 men. It declared war on the Ottoman Empire in October 1912 and Greek, Serbian, and Montenegrin armies advanced into Ottoman and Albanian territory. The Balkan allies were soon victorious. In Thrace, the Bulgarians defeated the main Ottoman forces, advanced into the outskirts of Istanbul, and lay in siege to Adrianople, which is today's Edirne. In Macedonia, the Serbian army achieved a great victory at Kumanovo that enabled it to capture Bitola and join forces with the Montenegrins and enter Skopje, today's capital of North Macedonia. The Greeks, meanwhile, captured the prestigious city of Salonika, today's Thessaloniki. At sea, the Greeks twice crushed the Ottoman navy. In Albania, to prevent the annihilation of their country, national delegates met at a congress in Vlore. On November 28, 1912, the Congress issued the Vlore Proclamation, which declared Albania's full independence. We should take a step back here to talk about the political developments in Istanbul. The Young Turks had come to power on a wave of enthusiasm for liberalism, constitutionalism, and democracy, but this was not to last. Opposition to the centralization policies of the Young Turks and their foreign policy disasters led to an opposition party, Freedom and Accord, being founded in November 1911. Freedom and Accord, also known as the Liberal Union, became a popular and viable challenger to the Young Turks and promoted greater understanding for and appreciation of minority rights in the empire, among other things. Elections were then held in April 1912. Not only did the Young Turks besmirch their liberal opponents in the build-up to these elections, accusing them of wishing to weaken Islam with their Western policies, they also rigged the results to ensure that they had a crushing electoral victory. The Young Turks had now gone from saviours of the constitution to ignoring it. In July, a group of senior, yet liberal military figures, known as the Saviour Officers, organized a coup and overthrew the rigged Young Turk government. However, soon after the Balkan Wars began and the Saviour Officers were soon overwhelmed and moreover associated with the stain of defeat, the Young Turks were able to recover their strength. In January 1913, another coup occurred, sorry if this gets confusing, and the Young Turks returned to power. The Ottoman government would now be run by the so-called Three Pashas, Talat, Enver and Jalal, who kept power until the end of the First World War. The Three Pashas would increase the centralization of the empire, with the resulting promotion of the Turkish language and concentration of power in Turkish hands. It is a mistake, however, to consider the Pashas as purely Turkish nationalists, at least in this early stage of their tenure. The new government, after the 1913 coup, was determined to keep the empire in the war and launched a wide counterattack on the Balkan forces. This failed, and the Bulgarians subsequently took the symbolic city of Edirne, which had once been the capital of the Ottoman Empire. Meanwhile, the Montenegrins took Shkoda in the west, which was a mostly Albanian city, sparking a mass refugee crisis as Albanians fled the region. Under a peace treaty signed in London on May 30th, 1913, the Ottoman Empire lost almost all of its remaining European territory, including all of Macedonia and Albania. Albanian independence was insisted upon by the European powers, and Macedonia was to be divided among the Balkan allies. All of the islands of the Aegean Sea were given to the Greeks. 500 years of Ottoman presence in Europe had now come to an end. The victors of the First Balkan War then began to squabble over the spoils. In particular, the Bulgarians, who had taken the lion's share of the territory in the First War, and had the unfortunate position of being in the middle of the other powers, were heavily resented by their neighbours. Bulgaria's large and well-drilled army had earned the country the reputation of being the Prussia of the Balkans, and Bulgarian intentions were widely distrusted. On June 1st, just 2 days after the end of the war with the Ottomans, Serbia and Greece formed an anti-Bulgarian alliance. Following a 30-day standoff, on June 30th, 1913, the Bulgarian Tsar, Ferdinand, directed his forces to launch a surprise attack on both the Serbians and the Greeks simultaneously. The Bulgarian offensive, benefiting by surprise, was initially successful, but Greek and Serbian defenders were able to keep their shape and quickly counterattacked. Within just 10 days, a Serbian-Greek victory seemed assured. Violence was not only confined to the front lines, but was also directed against Bulgarian villages and villagers. Bulgaria's neighbours then all dogpiled the country at once. On July the 11th, the Romanian army crossed the Bulgarian frontier and began a march on Sofia, the Bulgarian capital. The following day, the Turks violated their armistice with Bulgaria and entered Thrace. The Greeks and the Serbs launched a general offensive on July 15th, and the Turks reoccupied Edirne on July 22nd. With their enemies converging on Sofia, the Bulgarians bowed to the inevitable. On July 30th, 1913, they concluded an armistice to end hostilities, and a peace agreement was signed between the combatants on August 10th. Under the terms of the treaty, Greece and Serbia divided most of Macedonia between them, leaving Bulgaria with only a small part of the region. Beside the appalling loss of military and civilian life, the result of the Balkan Wars was a redrawing of the map of Southeast Europe. As a result of the wars, Greece gained southern Macedonia, as well as the island of Crete. Serbia gained Kosovo and extended into northern and central Macedonia. Albania was made an independent state under a German prince. The war likewise altered the structure of alliances in the Balkans. Dissatisfied Bulgaria henceforth looked to Austria-Hungary for support, whereas Romania moved out of the influence of Germany and Austria and towards Russia and France. The Ottomans accelerated their military reforms and moved closer to Germany. In November 1913, the three Pashas secured the services of German General Otto Lippmann von Sanders with a group of technical advisors to strengthen the organization of the Ottoman army. The surprising loser of the conflict was Austria-Hungary. The new border between Serbia and Montenegro made it impossible for Austria-Hungary to intervene in the Balkans without going through Serbia first, an act that would appear as naked aggression. Tensions massively increased between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. Serbia had extensive claims upon Austrian territory in Bosnia, claims which the Serbs could now focus on, having ensured the restoration of the borders of Greater Serbia in the south. Having obtained an assurance of German support, Austria-Hungary delivered an ultimatum on October 17, 1913, to compel Serbia to withdraw from the Albanian borderlands. This, however, did not solve for Austria-Hungary the Southern Slav question, which emerged again in an acute form with the assassination of the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand by a Serb on June 28, 1914, in Sarajevo, Bosnia.